Welcome to part 2 of The Great Gatsby as reimagined in the style of Elmore Leonard. Thank you for listening to this episode of Classic Books Reimagined. If you are enjoying this book, please take a moment to like, share, or subscribe to this channel. If there is a classic book you would like to hear reimagined in the style of a modern author, please leave it in the comments. Chapter 5. As I pulled up to my home in West Egg that night, a blaze of light flooded the corner of the peninsula, casting an eerie glow on the shrubbery and sending elongated glints dancing along the roadside wires. My initial fear of a fire was quelled when I realized it was Gatsby's mansion, illuminated from top to bottom. Exiting the taxi, I saw Gatsby striding across his lawn towards me. "Your place looks like the World's Fair," I remarked, taking in the spectacle. "Does it?" Gatsby replied absently, his gaze wandering back to his mansion. "I've been peeking into some of the rooms. Let's head to Coney Island. Old sport. My car's ready." "It's too late," I responded, my weariness evident. "Then how about a swim in the pool? I've neglected it all summer," Gatsby suggested eagerly. "I need to hit the sack," I insisted. "Fair enough," he acquiesced, though there was a suppressed eagerness in his gaze. I spoke with Miss Baker. "I plan to invite Daisy over for tea tomorrow." "Oh, that's fine," Gatsby said casually, though his eyes betrayed a hint of concern. "I don't want to trouble you." "What day works for you?" I asked. "What day works for you?" Gatsby corrected quickly, his tone almost desperate. "I wouldn't want to inconvenience you, you see." "How about the day after tomorrow?" I proposed. Gatsby hesitated, then reluctantly replied, "I need to get the grass trimmed." Glancing at the neatly manicured lawn that sharply contrasted with my own, I sensed his implication. "Is there something else?" I prompted. After a moment's hesitation, Gatsby broached the subject. "You don't earn much, do you?" "Not much," I admitted. Seemingly reassured, Gatsby continued, "I have a little side business, confidential in nature. It wouldn't take much of your time, and the payoff could be substantial." Under different circumstances, his offer might have been pivotal, but I had to decline. "I'm swamped as it is. Can't take on more work." "You wouldn't have to deal with Wolfsheim," Gatsby assured, misinterpreting my reluctance, but I held firm, ending the conversation there. Later, as I entered my home, the evening's events left me lightheaded. I drifted into a deep sleep, unaware of Gatsby's activities or whether he made it to Coney Island. The following morning, I called Daisy from the office and extended the invitation for tea. "Don't bring Tom," I cautioned. "Who's Tom?" she innocently inquired. The agreed-upon day arrived amidst pouring rain. A man arrived sent by Gatsby to mow my lawn. Realizing I forgot to summon my Finn, I ventured into West Egg Village to search for her amidst the rain-soaked alleys and to procure some supplies. At 2 o'clock, a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's, laden with flowers. An hour later, Gatsby himself appeared, dressed in a white flannel suit that seemed out of place in the dreary weather. "Is everything all right?" he asked anxiously. "The grass looks fine," I assured him. Gatsby seemed oblivious to the grass, his mind elsewhere. "Do we have everything for tea?" he inquired. In the pantry, we inspected the lemon cakes from the deli. "Will these do?" I asked. Of course, they're fine," Gatsby replied hollowly. As the rain abated to a mist, Gatsby appeared distracted, flipping through a book on economics and pacing the kitchen floor. Eventually, he announced his departure, citing the absence of guests. "Why leave?" I questioned. "No one's coming. It's too late," Gatsby exclaimed, eyeing his watch with urgency. "Nonsense, it's just 2 minutes to 4, I retorted, coaxing him to stay. Reluctantly, he sat, but his tension remained palpable. Then, the sound of a motor heralded Daisy's arrival. In the rain, Her face lit up beneath a lavender hat as she stepped from the car. "Is this where you live, my dearest?" she exclaimed, her voice a tonic against the dreary weather. After exchanging pleasantries, Gatsby's entrance into the living room was anything but smooth. Pale and tense, he stood as if frozen, his eyes fixed on Daisy. With an air of forced ease, Gatsby lounged against the mantelpiece, his hands buried in his pockets, while Daisy perched nervously on the edge of a chair. "We've crossed paths before," Gatsby muttered, his eyes flicking briefly in my direction, a failed chuckle escaping his lips. Just then, the clock teetered dangerously as if under the weight of his thoughts. With a trembling hand, he steadied it back into place before sinking into the sofa, rigid, chin resting heavily in his hand. "Sorry about the clock," he apologized, breaking the heavy silence that enveloped us. My face flushed with embarrassment, unable to summon any coherent response. "It's an old clock," I managed to blurt out, feeling utterly foolish. For a moment, it seemed as though the clock had shattered into a million pieces on the floor. "We haven't seen each other in years," Daisy remarked, her tone matter-of-fact. "5 years come November," Gatsby replied automatically, the words lacking any genuine emotion. The awkwardness hung thick in the air until I impulsively suggested we make tea in the kitchen. Amidst the chaos of cups and cakes, a semblance of normalcy settled in. Gatsby hovered in the shadows, his gaze shifting between Daisy and me with a tense unease. When the opportunity presented itself, I excused myself, eager to escape the stifling atmosphere. "Where are you off to?" Gatsby demanded, his alarm palpable. "Just stepping out for a moment," I reassured him, but he persisted, urgency tainting his voice. "There's something I need to discuss before you go." He followed me frantically into the kitchen, shutting the door behind us with a whisper. "Oh, God," he murmured miserably. "What's wrong?" I inquired, concern etched into my features. "This is a terrible mistake," he confessed, shaking his head in despair. "A terrible, terrible mistake." "You're just feeling embarrassed," I reassured him, hoping to dispel some of his anxiety. "Daisy's feeling it too." "She's embarrassed?" he echoed incredulously. "Just as much as you are," I affirmed. "Lower your voice," he urged, his tone urgent. "You're behaving like a child," I admonished, frustration creeping into my voice. "And it's rude. Daisy's sitting out there alone." He silenced me with a raised hand, a look of reproach etched into his features, before cautiously reopening the door and retreating into the living room. I slipped out the back, mirroring Gatsby's earlier nervous circuit around the house. Taking refuge beneath a massive, knotted tree, I watched the rain pour down, soaking the irregular lawn. After what felt like an eternity, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a glimmer of hope on the scene. I made my way back inside, but the once vibrant chatter had been replaced by an eerie silence. Entering the room, I found Daisy with tear-streaked cheeks, hastily attempting to wipe them dry. Gatsby, however, seemed transformed, exuding a newfound sense of vitality. "Hey, old sport," he greeted me as if we were long-lost friends, a smile lighting up his face. "The rain's stopped." "Has it?" I remarked, noticing the sunlight streaming into the room. His eyes sparkled with a joy that was infectious as he shared the news with Daisy. "What do you know?" "The rain's stopped." "I'm glad, Jay," Daisy murmured, her voice tinged with unexpected happiness. "I want you both to come over to my place," Gatsby announced eagerly. "I'd love to show Daisy around." "You're sure you want me there?" I queried. "Absolutely, old sport," Gatsby confirmed. As Daisy retreated to freshen up, Gatsby and I waited on the lawn. "My house looks magnificent, doesn't it?" he remarked proudly, gesturing towards the grand facade. I nodded in agreement. "Indeed it does." He gazed at his home with a mixture of pride and nostalgia. Took me 3 years to earn enough to buy it. I thought you inherited your wealth, I remarked. I did, old sport, he admitted, but lost most of it in the war. His words seemed to tumble out without much thought, and when I pressed him about his business ventures, he grew evasive. As Daisy emerged, resplendent in her dress, Gatsby's eyes never left her. We set off for his mansion, taking the scenic route along the Sound. Daisy marveled at the grandeur of the estate, her eyes sparkling with wonder. Inside, as we explored the opulent rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that unseen guests lurked in every corner, awaiting our passage. Gatsby's presence seemed to infuse every inch of the mansion, as if he had imbued it with his very essence. Descending to his private quarters, Gatsby's demeanor shifted once more. He pulled out an array of shirts, each more lavish than the last, while Daisy watched in awe. But as she buried her face in the folds, overcome with emotion, Gatsby's laughter rang out, filled with a mixture of disbelief and joy. "They're such beautiful shirts," Daisy sobbed, her voice muffled by the fabric. "I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." Gatsby's expression softened, his eyes never leaving Daisy's tear-streaked face. In that moment, it was as if everything he had ever desired lay before him, tangible and within reach. Outside, the rain drizzled down, obscuring the view of the bay. Gatsby, Daisy, and I stood by the window, gazing at the mist-shrouded expanse of water. "If it weren't for this mist, we'd see your place across the bay," Gatsby remarked. "You always have a green light burning on your dock." Daisy linked her arm through his, but Gatsby seemed lost in contemplation. Perhaps he realized the once significant symbolism of that light had faded into obscurity. What was once a beacon of hope, now reduced to a mere flicker. I wandered around the dimly lit room, inspecting various vague objects. A large photograph caught my eye, a distinguished man in yachting attire. "Who's this?" I inquired. That's Mr. Dan Cody, old sport," Gatsby replied. "He used to be my closest friend years ago. He's gone now." A smaller picture of Gatsby adorned the bureau, depicting him in his youth, head held high with defiance. "I adore it," Daisy exclaimed, her eyes twinkling. "The pompadour. You never told me about your pompadour or your yacht." "Take a look at this," Gatsby interjected eagerly, producing a collection of clippings. "These are about you." They stood side by side, perusing the clippings, while I pondered about the rubies I had yet to see. Suddenly the phone rang, and Gatsby hurriedly picked it up. "Yes. Well, I can't talk now. I said a small town." Gatsby's voice trailed off, frustration evident in his tone. "Come here, quick," Daisy called from the window. Despite the rain, a breathtaking sight unfolded, a magnificent display of pink and golden clouds above the sea. "Isn't that something?" Daisy whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wish I could take one of those pink clouds and put you in it, and push you around." I attempted to leave, but they insisted I stay, craving the comfort of each other's company. "I know what we'll do," Gatsby declared. "We'll have Klipspringer play the piano." He summoned a disheveled young man, Klipspringer, who appeared slightly dazed, wearing a mismatched ensemble of clothes. "Did we interrupt your exercise?" Daisy inquired politely. "I was asleep," Klipspringer confessed sheepishly. I'd been asleep. Then I got up." "Klipspringer plays the piano," Gatsby interjected, cutting off his rambling. "We'll go downstairs," Gatsby announced, flipping a switch to illuminate the house in a warm glow. In the music room, Gatsby lit Daisy's cigarette with a trembling match, and they settled on a couch enveloped in shadows. As Klipspringer reluctantly played The Love Nest, Gatsby commanded him to continue despite his protests. Outside, the wind howled, and the distant rumble of thunder echoed across the Sound. Lights twinkled in West Egg as the electric trains ferried people home from New York. It was a time of profound change, and anticipation hung heavy in the air. As I prepared to bid them farewell, I noticed a flicker of doubt in Gatsby's eyes, a fleeting uncertainty amidst his apparent happiness. Almost 5 years had passed since he had seen Daisy, and reality threatened to dim the brightness of his dreams. His hand found hers, and as she whispered something in his ear, a surge of emotion washed over him. I realized then that her voice, with its fervent warmth, held him captive in a way nothing else could. They had forgotten my presence entirely as Daisy extended her hand to me. Gatsby, lost in his own world, no longer recognized me. With one final glance at the mesmerizing couple, I left them to their intense, intimate moment, stepping out into the rain-soaked night, leaving them to their shared reality. Chapter 6. It was a sweltering summer morning when a young, ambitious reporter from New York showed up at Gatsby's grand door. He was slick and sharp, his notepad tucked into the pocket of his rumpled trench coat, a fedora tilted just so over his brow. Knocking with the confidence of a man used to getting answers, he waited for Gatsby. Gatsby, always the picture of polished grace in his immaculate white suit and pink shirt, opened the door. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice smooth as silk. "Got any statement to give out?" the reporter asked, a glint of curiosity in his eyes. "Statement? About what?" Gatsby responded politely, though his tone had a hint of steel behind it. The reporter fumbled for a moment. "Heard your name buzzing around the office. Figured there might be a story worth chasing." Gatsby chuckled softly. "A story, you say? Come in, let's talk." Inside, the mansion was a blend of opulence and mystery, much like Gatsby himself. Crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across the polished marble floors, and the air was thick with the scent of fresh flowers and old money. The young man was shooting in the dark, but his instincts were sharp. Gatsby's reputation had grown over the summer, whispered tales among those who'd enjoyed his legendary hospitality. Stories swirled of an underground pipeline to Canada and a houseboat masquerading as a mansion that prowled the Long Island shores. But the truth, as tangled and romantic as the man himself, lay elsewhere. Gatsby, James Gatz from North Dakota, had reinvented himself at 17 when he first laid eyes on Dan Cody's yacht anchored on Lake Superior. Back then, he was just a drifter in a torn green jersey and canvas pants. But in his heart, he was already Jay Gatsby. Gatz's parents were shiftless farmers, but in his mind he was destined for something greater. He believed he was a son of God, born to chase a grand, vulgar, and mesmerizing beauty. And so, he became Jay Gatsby, a name as fabricated and grand as his dreams. For over a year, he had wandered the southern shores of Lake Superior, working as a clam digger and salmon fisher. His body grew hard and brown from the labor, living the fierce, lazy life of the open water. He knew women early, discarded them just as quickly, becoming contemptuous of both the virgins and the experienced alike. His heart, however, was a riot of dreams and ambitions. Nights were spent in restless fantasies where a universe of garish splendor spun in his mind. By day, he was grounded in the rough reality of his work, but by night, he was a dreamer, building castles in the air. Gatsby's ambition had led him to a small Lutheran college, St. Olaf Ace in Minnesota. But he stayed only 2 weeks, repelled by its indifference to his dreams and the drudgery of the janitor's work he did to pay his way. Disillusioned, he drifted back to Lake Superior, still searching for his destiny. And then came the day Dan Cody's yacht dropped anchor in the shallows. It was a moment of transformation. James Gatz, now Jay Gatsby, borrowed a rowboat, rowed out to the yacht, and warned Cody of the impending storm that could wreck him. This meeting with Cody was the catalyst, the spark that ignited Gatsby's journey toward the man he was destined to become. Cody, a wealthy and dissolute man, took Gatsby under his wing. Gatsby learned the ways of the rich, the allure of wealth, and the art of reinvention. From then on, Gatsby's life was a series of orchestrated moves, each step calculated to create the man who would one day stand before this young reporter, enigmatic and grand. As the reporter scribbled notes, Gatsby's thoughts drifted. The young man before him had no idea of the depths beneath the surface, the wild, restless heart that beat within Gatsby's chest. He offered a charming smile, the kind that hinted at secrets and adventures. "There's always a story, old sport," Gatsby said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "But some stories are better left to the imagination." The reporter left with a few notes and a sense of having glimpsed something extraordinary, though he couldn't quite grasp it. Gatsby watched him go, a knowing smile playing on his lips. The summer air buzzed with the promise of more to come, and Gatsby, ever the dreamer, was ready to chase it down. Cody was 50 back then, a rough-hewn man molded by the Nevada silver fields, the Yukon, and every gold rush since '75. The Montana copper deals that turned him into a multimillionaire had left him physically robust, but teetering on the edge of mental decline. Sensing his vulnerability, countless women swooped in like vultures, eager to part him from his fortune. One such woman, Ella Kay, a sharp-tongued newspaper dame, played Cody like a fiddle, coaxing him onto a yacht and into the pages of tawdry journalism in 1902. After 5 years of drifting along two welcoming shores, Cody's path crossed with young James Gats's in Little Girl Bay. To Gats, lounging in his rowboat and gazing up at the yacht's gleaming deck, that vessel symbolized all the allure and excitement the world had to offer. He probably flashed a grin at Cody. Gats had already figured out that people responded well to his smile. Cody, seeing the spark of ambition in the kid, asked a few questions, one of which prompted Gats to unveil his new identity, J. Gatsby. Within days, Cody whisked him off to Duluth, outfitting him in a blue blazer, 6 pairs of white duck trousers, and a crisp yachting cap. When the Tuolumne set sail for the West Indies and the Barbary Coast, Gatsby was on board. In those days, Gatsby's role aboard Cody's yacht was as fluid as the ocean they sailed. Steward, mate, skipper, secretary, and even jailer, Gatsby wore many hats. Cody, who was acutely aware of his own excesses, especially when inebriated, relied more and more on Gatsby to keep things in check. Their arrangement spanned 5 years and 3 voyages around the globe. It might have continued indefinitely if not for Ella Kay. She appeared one night in Boston, and within a week, Dan Cody was dead, suspiciously swift and sudden. I remember the portrait in Gatsby's bedroom, a gray, florid man with a hard, vacant stare, the quintessential pioneer debauchee. Cody had brought the raw violence of the frontier brothel and saloon back to the eastern seaboard. Ironically, Cody's influence was why Gatsby drank so sparingly. At parties, women would sometimes douse Gatsby's hair with champagne, but he himself rarely touched the stuff. From Cody, Gatsby was supposed to inherit $25,000, a hefty sum, but he never saw a dime of it. The legal trickery that robbed him was beyond his understanding, leaving the bulk of Cody's millions to Ella Kay. Yet Gatsby didn't walk away empty-handed. He emerged from those years with an education far more valuable than money, and the outline of J. Gatsby solidified into the man he would become. As I reflect on those times, it's clear that Cody's tutelage and Gatsby's relentless ambition forged a unique bond. It was in the crucible of those years that Gatsby, born James Gatz, truly became the enigmatic figure who would later captivate all of West Egg. He told me all this much later, but I've laid it out here to dispel those wild rumors about his background, none of which were even remotely true. Gatsby shared this with me during a time of confusion, a period when I was prepared to believe anything and everything about him. So while Gatsby caught his breath, I'll clear away these misconceptions. For a while, I didn't see or hear from Gatsby. I was mostly in New York, spending time with Jordan and trying to ingratiate myself with her senile aunt. Eventually, I decided to visit Gatsby one Sunday afternoon. I hadn't been there 2 minutes when Tom Buchanan showed up for a drink. It startled me, but it was surprising it hadn't happened sooner. Tom was part of a horseback riding trio, along with a man named Sloane and a striking woman in a brown riding habit who had been there before. Gatsby, standing on his porch, greeted them. "I'm delighted to see you," he said, his voice smooth and welcoming. "Please, come in." They didn't care, of course, but Gatsby was determined to play the gracious host. "Sit down. Have a cigarette or a cigar?" He moved briskly around the room, ringing bells. "I'll have drinks for you in just a moment." The presence of Tom clearly unsettled Gatsby, but he masked his unease with hospitality. Mr. Sloane declined everything offered: lemonade, champagne, anything. "No, thanks. I'm sorry. Did you have a nice ride?" Gatsby asked, trying to make conversation. "Good roads around here," Sloane replied curtly. "I suppose the automobiles—" Gatsby started. "Yeah," Tom interrupted, his tone dismissive. Driven by a sudden impulse, Gatsby turned to Tom. "I believe we've met before, Mr. Buchanan." Tom, gruffly polite, replied, "Oh, yes, so we did. I remember." "About 2 weeks ago," Gatsby pressed. "That's right. You were with Nick here," Tom acknowledged. "I know your wife," Gatsby added, almost aggressively. "That's so?" Tom turned to me. "You live near here, Nick?" "Next door," I replied. "That's so?" Tom repeated. Mr. Sloane lounged back in his chair, silent, while the woman said nothing until, after 2 highballs, she became suddenly cordial. "We'll all come to your next party, Mr. Gatsby," she suggested brightly. "Certainly, I'd be delighted to have you," Gatsby responded. "Beaver nice," Sloane said without gratitude. "Well, think we ought to be going." "Please don't hurry," Gatsby urged, gaining control of himself. "Why don't you stay for supper? Some other people might drop in from New York." "You come to supper with me?" the woman insisted, including me in her invitation. Sloane got to his feet. "Come along," he said, addressing her only. "I mean it," she repeated to Gatsby. "Lots of room." Gatsby looked at me, wanting to go but sensing Sloane's resistance. "I haven't got a horse," he said. "I used to ride in the army, but I've never bought a horse. I'll follow you in my car. Excuse me for just a minute." We walked out to the porch, where Sloane and the lady engaged in a hushed, heated conversation. "My God, the man's coming," Tom muttered. "Doesn't he know she doesn't want him?" "She says she does want him," I pointed out. "She has a big dinner party. He won't know a soul there." Tom frowned. "I wonder where he met Daisy. Women run around too much these days, meeting all kinds of crazy people." Sloane and the woman mounted their horses. "Come on," Sloane said to Tom. "We're late." Tom and I shook hands, exchanging cool nods with the others as they trotted down the drive, disappearing under the August foliage just as Gatsby, hat and coat in hand, emerged from the house. Tom's concern over Daisy's activities brought him to Gatsby's next party. That evening, there was a peculiar oppressiveness, a tension that hung in the air, the same crowd, the same champagne. But something was off. Or perhaps I had grown used to West Egg's excesses and now saw it through Daisy's eyes. Her presence revealed a rawness and a vulgarity that I had come to accept as normal. They arrived at twilight. As we mingled with the glittering crowd, Daisy whispered, "These things excite me so. If you want to kiss me, Nick, just let me know and I'll arrange it. Just mention my name." "Look around," Gatsby suggested. "I'm looking around. I'm having a marvelous time." "You must recognize some faces," Gatsby said, indicating a stunning woman under a white plum tree. Tom and Daisy stared, recognizing the movie star. "She's lovely," Daisy said. "The man with her is her director," Gatsby explained, guiding them from group to group. "Mrs. Buchanan and Mr. Buchanan, the polo player." "Oh, no," Tom objected quickly. "Not me." But Gatsby seemed to relish the title, and Tom remained the polo player for the rest of the evening. Daisy and Gatsby danced, their movements graceful and synchronized. Later, they sat on my steps while I watched from the garden. Tom reappeared as we were sitting down to supper. "Do you mind if I eat with some people over here?" he asked. "Go ahead," Daisy replied, handing him her little gold pencil, "if you want to take down any addresses." Daisy soon realized she wasn't having a good time. We sat at a particularly rowdy table, the air thick with a bitterness that hadn't been there before. "How do you feel, Miss Baedeker?" I asked a slumping girl. "Wah," she mumbled, sitting up. Another woman, urging Daisy to play golf the next day, defended her. "She's fine now, just had too many cocktails." "I do leave it alone," Miss Baedeker insisted hollowly. "We heard you yelling, so we brought Doc Sivert." "Much obliged, I'm sure," another friend said, "but you got her dress all wet when you stuck her head in the pool." "Anything I hate is getting my head stuck in a pool," Miss Baedeker grumbled. "You should leave it alone," Doc Sivert countered. "Speak for yourself," she retorted. "Your hand shakes. I wouldn't let you operate on me." The last thing I remember was watching the director and his star, their faces almost touching under the white plum tree. "I like her," Daisy said. "She's lovely." But the rest offended her. She was appalled by West Egg's rawness and simplicity. As they waited for their car, Tom suddenly demanded, "Who is this Gatsby? Some big bootlegger?" "Where'd you hear that?" I asked. "I didn't. I imagined it. These newly rich people are just big bootleggers." "Not Gatsby," I said. Tom was silent, crunching the pebbles underfoot. "Well, he must have strained to get this menagerie together." A breeze stirred Daisy's fur collar. "At least they're more interesting than our crowd," she said. "You didn't look so interested." "Well, I was." Tom turned to me. "Did you see Daisy's face when that girl asked her to put her under a cold shower?" Daisy began singing with the music, her voice infusing the words with new meaning. "Lots of people come uninvited," she said suddenly. "That girl hadn't been invited. They just forced their way in, and he's too polite to object." "I want to know who he is and what he does," Tom insisted. "I can tell you now," Daisy replied. "He owned drugstores, built them himself." Their car rolled up. "Good night, Nick," Daisy said. Her eyes drifted away from me and fixed on the top of the steps, where, 3 o'clock in the morning, a wistful waltz floated out through the open door. There was a sense of romance in Gatsby's party, something entirely absent from her world. What was it in that melody that seemed to pull her back inside? What would unfold in the dim, uncertain hours? Perhaps some extraordinary guest would arrive, a person of rare beauty who, with just one look at Gatsby, could erase those 5 years of unbroken devotion. I stayed late that night. Gatsby asked me to wait until he was free, so I lingered in the garden. I watched as the inevitable swimming party emerged from the black beach, shivering and exhilarated, until the lights in the guest rooms were finally extinguished. When Gatsby came down the steps at last, his tanned skin was stretched tight over his face, his eyes bright but weary. "She didn't like it," he said immediately. "Of course she did." "No, she didn't," he insisted, his voice heavy with disappointment. She didn't have a good time." He fell silent, and I could sense the depth of his unspoken despair. "I feel distant from her," he confessed. "It's hard to make her understand." "About the dance?" He waved his hand dismissively. "The dance? That doesn't matter, old sport." Gatsby wanted Daisy to go to Tom and declare, "I never loved you." He envisioned them erasing 4 years with that single sentence, then making plans for their future. They were supposed to return to Louisville and get married as if it were 5 years ago. "And she doesn't get it," he said. "She used to understand. We could sit for hours." He broke off, pacing up and down a desolate path littered with fruit rinds, discarded party favors, and crushed flowers. "I wouldn't ask too much of her," I ventured. "You can't repeat the past." "Can't repeat the past?" he echoed, incredulous. "Why, of course you can." He looked around wildly, as if searching for the past in the shadows of his house, just out of reach. "I'm going to fix everything just the way it was before," he said, nodding with determination. "She'll see." He talked a lot about the past, trying to recover something, some part of himself that had gone into loving Daisy. His life had been a chaotic mess since then, but he believed that if he could return to a certain point and relive it slowly, he could find what he had lost. One autumn night, 5 years earlier, they had walked down a street, the leaves falling around them, the sidewalk glowing white under the moonlight. They stopped where there were no trees, and Gatsby looked at Daisy, feeling the magic of the moment. He saw the sidewalk blocks as a ladder leading to a secret place above the trees, a place where he could taste the incomparable milk of wonder. His heart pounded as Daisy's pale face approached his. He knew that when he kissed her, he would forever bind his dreams to her breath, and his mind would never roam freely again. So he waited, listening to the silent music of the stars. Then he kissed her. At his touch, she blossomed like a flower, and his transformation was complete. Through all he said, despite his overwhelming sentimentality, I sensed something familiar, an elusive rhythm, a fragment of forgotten words. For a moment, a phrase tried to form on my lips, but it vanished before I could speak it. What I almost remembered slipped away, uncommunicable forever. Chapter 7. It was when the curiosity about Gatsby hit fever pitch that the lights in his mansion failed to flicker on one Saturday night. Just like that, his reign as Trimalchio ended. The usual parade of automobiles that turned into his driveway left just as quickly, sulking away in the darkness. Concerned, I went over to check on him. An unfamiliar butler, a hard-faced man with eyes like a shark, squinted at me through the door. "Is Mr. Gatsby sick?" I asked. "Nope." He paused, then grudgingly added, "Sir, I haven't seen him around and I was worried. Tell him Mr. Carraway stopped by." "Who?" His tone was rude, challenging. "Carraway," I repeated. "Carraway, fine. I'll tell him." With that, he slammed the door in my face. My Finn later informed me that Gatsby had fired his entire staff a week ago, replacing them with a new mysterious crew. These new folks never ventured into West Egg Village, ordering modest supplies over the phone. The grocery boy reported the kitchen looked like a pigsty, and the village consensus was that these new hires were no real servants. The next day Gatsby called. "Going away?" I asked. "No, old sport," he replied. "I hear you fired all your servants." "I needed people who wouldn't gossip. Daisy comes over quite often in the afternoons." The entire facade had crumbled because of Daisy's disapproval. "There's some people Wolfsheim wanted to help. They're all brothers and sisters. They used to run a small hotel." "I see." Gatsby was calling on Daisy's behalf, inviting me to lunch at her place the next day. Miss Baker would be there too. Half an hour later, Daisy herself called, relieved to confirm I was coming. Something was definitely up. Yet, I couldn't believe they'd picked this moment for the showdown Gatsby had described. The next day was scorching, probably the hottest day of the summer. As my train emerged from the tunnel, only the shrill whistles of the National Biscuit Company broke the simmering noon hush. The straw seats felt like they might ignite. The woman beside me, sweating in her white shirtwaist, eventually slumped in despair, her newspaper damp with perspiration. "Oh my!" she gasped as her pocketbook fell. I bent wearily to pick it up, holding it delicately by the corners to show I had no ulterior motives, though everyone, including the woman, eyed me with suspicion. "Hot enough for you?" the conductor asked, his commutation ticket stained with sweat. Through the hall of the Buchanan's house, a faint wind carried the sound of the phone ringing. The butler's voice bellowed, "The master's body? I'm sorry, madame, it's too hot to move." What he actually said was, "Yes, yes, I'll see." He set the receiver down and came towards us, slightly glistening, to take our stiff straw hats. "Madame expects you in the salon," he announced, as if we didn't know the way. The room, dark and cool under the awnings, held Daisy and Jordan reclining on a massive couch, their white dresses pressed down by the singing breeze of the fans. "We can't move," they said in unison. Jordan's fingers, powdered white over their tan, rested briefly in mine. "And Mr. Thomas Buchanan, the athlete?" I asked. Simultaneously, Tom's gruff voice boomed from the hallway phone. Gatsby stood in the center of the crimson carpet, his eyes scanning the room with fascination. Daisy watched him, laughing sweetly, a tiny puff of powder rising from her bosom. "The rumor is," whispered Jordan, "that's Tom's girl on the phone." We fell silent. Tom's voice rose, irritated. "Very well, then. I won't sell you the car at all. I'm under no obligations to you. And don't bother me at lunchtime." Holding down the receiver, Daisy said cynically. "No, he's not," I assured her. "It's a genuine deal. I know about it." Tom flung the door open, filling the space with his thick frame, and hurried into the room. "Mr. Gatsby," he extended his hand with poorly concealed dislike. "I'm glad to see you, sir." "Nick, make us a cold drink," cried Daisy. As Tom left the room, Daisy rose, walked over to Gatsby, and pulled his face down, kissing him on the mouth. "You know I love you," Daisy murmured, her voice low and sultry. Jordan, lounging elegantly, smirked. "You forget there's a lady present." Daisy shot her a doubtful glance, then kissed Nick too. "What a low, vulgar girl," Jordan teased, but there was no real malice in her tone. "I don't care," Daisy cried, a wild glint in her eye as she began to clog on the brick fireplace. The heat quickly caught up with her, and she collapsed guiltily onto the couch just as a freshly laundered nurse entered, leading a little girl. "Blessed precious," Daisy cooed, extending her arms. "Come to your own mother that loves you." The child, let go by the nurse, scurried across the room and buried her face in Daisy's dress. "The blessed precious. Did mother get powder on your old yellowy hair? Stand up now and say, 'How-de-do.'" Gatsby and I leaned down, taking the small, reluctant hand in turn. Gatsby kept staring at the child, as if he couldn't quite believe she existed. "I got dressed before luncheon," the child announced eagerly, turning to Daisy. "That's because your mother wanted to show you off," Daisy replied, her face nuzzling the child's neck. "You dream. You absolute little dream." "Yes," the child said calmly. "Aunt Jordan's got on a white dress too." "How do you like mother's friends?" Daisy turned the child to face Gatsby. "Do you think they're pretty?" "Where's Daddy?" the child asked. "She doesn't look like her father," Daisy explained. "She looks like me. She's got my hair and shape of the face." Daisy reclined on the couch as the nurse stepped forward. Come, Pammy. Goodbye, sweetheart, Daisy called, as the well-behaved child, with a reluctant backward glance, held the nurse's hand and was led out just as Tom re-entered, carrying 4 gin rickeys clinking with ice. Gatsby picked up his drink. They certainly look cool, he said, a visible tension in his voice. We drank in long, greedy swallows. I read somewhere that the sun's getting hotter every year, Tom said cheerfully. Pretty soon the Earth's going to fall into the sun. Or wait, no, it's the opposite. The sun's getting colder. Come outside, he suggested to Gatsby. I'd like you to have a look at the place. I joined them on the veranda. The Green Sound lay stagnant in the heat, a single sailboat crawling slowly toward the open sea. Gatsby's eyes followed it. He raised his hand and pointed across the bay. I'm right across from you. So you are. Our eyes swept over the rose beds, the hot lawn, and the weedy shoreline. The white wings of the boat moved slowly against the blue sky. There's sport for you, Tom nodded. I'd like to be out there for about an hour. We had lunch in the dining room, darkened against the heat. The cold ale helped wash down our nervous chatter. What'll we do this afternoon? Daisy cried. And the day after that? And the next 30 years? Don't be morbid, Jordan said. Life starts all over again when it gets crisp in the fall. But it's so hot, Daisy insisted, near tears. Everything's so confused. Let's all go to town. Her voice fought against the oppressive heat. I've heard of making a garage out of a stable, Tom was saying to Gatsby. But I'm the first man who ever made a stable out of a garage. Who wants to go to town? Daisy demanded. Gatsby's eyes met hers. Ah, she sighed. You look so cool. Their eyes locked, an unspoken understanding passing between them. You always look so cool, she repeated. She had told him she loved him, and Tom saw. His mouth dropped slightly as he looked at Gatsby, then back at Daisy, recognizing her anew. You resemble the advertisement of the man, she continued innocently. You know, the advertisement. All right, Tom interrupted sharply. I'm perfectly willing to go to town. Come on, we're all going. He stood up, his eyes darting between Gatsby and Daisy. No one moved. Come on, his temper flared. What's the matter? If we're going to town, let's start. His hand trembled as he drained the last of his ale. Daisy's voice rallied us to our feet and out onto the blazing gravel drive. Are we just going to go? She objected. Like this? Can't anyone smoke a cigarette first? Everybody smoked through lunch. Oh, let's have fun, she begged. It's too hot to fuss. Tom didn't answer. Have it your way, she said. Come on, Jordan. They went upstairs to get ready while the 3 of us shuffled the hot pebbles with our feet. The silver curve of the moon already hovered in the western sky. Gatsby started to speak, thought better of it, but not before Tom wheeled around. Have you got your stables here? Gatsby asked. About 1/4 mile down the road. Oh, a pause. I don't see the idea of going to town, Tom burst out. Women get these notions. Shall we take anything to drink? Daisy called from an upper window. I'll get some whiskey, Tom replied, heading inside. Gatsby turned to me, his face rigid. I can't say anything in his house, old sport. She's got an indiscreet voice, I remarked. It's full of... I hesitated. Her voice is full of money, he said suddenly. That was it. I'd never understood before. It was full of money. That was the inexhaustible charm that rose and fell in it, the jingle of it, the cymbal's song of it. High in a white palace, the king's daughter, the golden girl. Tom emerged, wrapping a quart bottle in a towel, followed by Daisy and Jordan in tight metallic hats and light capes. Shall we all go in my car? Gatsby suggested, feeling the hot leather seat. I ought to have left it in the shade. Is it standard shift? Tom demanded. Yes. Then you take my coupe, and I'll drive your car to town. Gatsby clearly disliked the idea. I don't think there's much gas, he objected. Plenty of gas, Tom said boisterously, checking the gauge. And if it runs out, I can stop at a drugstore. You can buy anything at a drugstore these days. A pause followed. Daisy frowned at Tom, while an indefinable expression passed over Gatsby's face, as if he recognized something familiar, yet distant. Come on, Daisy, Tom pressed, guiding her toward Gatsby's car. I'll take you in this circus wagon. He opened the door, but Daisy slipped away from his arm. You take Nick and Jordan. We'll follow in the coupe. She moved close to Gatsby, her hand brushing his coat. Jordan, Tom, and I climbed into the front seat of Gatsby's car. Tom fiddled with the unfamiliar gears, and we shot off into the oppressive heat, leaving Gatsby and Daisy behind. Did you see that? Tom demanded, his face flushed. See what? I asked, though I had a good idea. He looked at me sharply, realization dawning that Jordan and I had known all along. You think I'm dumb, don't you? Maybe I am, but sometimes I get this sixth sense, like I know what's going on. Maybe you don't believe that, but science... He paused, the immediate situation pulling him back from his rambling thoughts. I've been looking into this, Gatsby, he continued. Could have dug deeper if I'd known... You mean you went to a medium? Jordan teased. A medium? Tom stared at us, bewildered as we laughed. No, I said I've been investigating his past. And you found out he was an Oxford man, Jordan added helpfully. An Oxford man? Tom was incredulous. Like hell he is. The guy wears a pink suit. Nevertheless, he's an Oxford man, Jordan insisted. Oxford, New Mexico, Tom sneered, or somewhere like that. Listen, Tom, if you're such a snob, why'd you invite him to lunch? Jordan retorted. Daisy invited him. She knew him before we were married. God knows where. We fell silent, the heat and the fading effects of the ale making us irritable. As we approached the faded eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, I remembered Gatsby's caution about gasoline. We've got enough to get us to town, Tom declared. But there's a garage right here, Jordan objected. I don't want to get stalled in this baking heat. Tom impatiently slammed on both brakes, and we skidded to a dusty stop under Wilson's sign. After a moment, Wilson emerged from the dim interior, his eyes hollow and shadowed. Let's have some gas, Tom barked. What do you think we stopped for? To admire the view. I'm sick, Wilson said without moving. Been sick all day. What's the matter? Tom asked, irritation edging his voice. I'm all run down. Shall I help myself? Tom demanded. You sounded fine on the phone. Wilson, breathing hard, dragged himself from the doorway to unscrew the cap of the tank. In the sunlight, his face looked green. I didn't mean to interrupt your lunch, he said. But I need money bad, and I was wondering what you're going to do with your old car. How do you like this one? Tom asked. Bought it last week. It's nice, Wilson said faintly. Yellow. Want to buy it? Wilson managed a weak smile. Big chance. No, but I could make some money on the other. What do you need money for all of a sudden? I've been here too long. I want to get away. My wife and I want to go west. Your wife does? Tom exclaimed, startled. She's been talking about it for 10 years. He rested against the pump, shading his eyes. Now she's going whether she wants to or not. I'm getting her away. The coupe flashed by us, dust swirling, and a hand waved from inside. What do I owe you? Tom demanded harshly. I just got wise to something funny the last 2 days, Wilson said. That's why I need to get away. That's why I've been bothering you about the car. What do I owe you? $1.20. The relentless heat was getting to me, and I had a moment of confusion before realizing Wilson hadn't suspected Tom yet. He'd discovered Myrtle had another life, and it had made him physically sick. I looked from him to Tom, both men struggling with their discoveries. "I'll let you have that car," Tom said. "I'll send it over tomorrow afternoon." The area was always vaguely unsettling, even in the afternoon glare. I turned my head, feeling watched. Over the ash heaps, Dr. T.J. Eckelberg's eyes kept their vigil, but I realized other eyes were watching us too. In a window over the garage, the curtains had shifted, and Myrtle Wilson was peering down at us. She was so engrossed she didn't notice us observing her, her face contorting with jealousy and fear, as she stared not at Tom, but at Jordan, whom she mistook for Tom's wife. There is no confusion like the confusion of a simple mind, and as we drove away, Tom felt the sting of panic. His wife and his mistress, until an hour ago secure and inviolate, were slipping from his grasp. Instinctively, he floored the accelerator, desperate to overtake Daisy and leave Wilson far behind. We sped toward Astoria at 50 miles an hour, weaving through the spidery girders of the elevated tracks until the blue coupe came into view. "Those big movie theaters around 50th Street are cool," suggested Jordan, leaning back in the seat. "I love New York on summer afternoons when everyone's away. There's something very sensuous about it. Overripe, as if all sorts of funny fruits were going to fall into your hands." The word sensuous unsettled Tom further, but before he could object, the coupe stopped, and Daisy signaled us to pull up alongside. "Where are we going?" she called out. "How about the movies?" Tom suggested. "It's so hot," Daisy complained. "You go. We'll ride around and meet you after." She forced a smile. "We'll meet you on some corner. I'll be the man smoking 2 cigarettes." "We can't argue here," Tom said impatiently as a truck blasted its horn behind us. "Follow me to the south side of Central Park, in front of the plaza." Several times Tom looked back, anxious that they might disappear down a side street and out of his life forever. But they didn't, and soon we all found ourselves in the parlor of a suite at the Plaza Hotel. The argument that landed us there was a blur. I remember my underwear climbing like a damp snake around my legs and beads of sweat racing down my back. The idea had started with Daisy suggesting cold baths and turned into a place to have a mint julep. We all babbled at once to a bewildered clerk, thinking ourselves funny. The room was large and stifling, even with the windows open to the hot gusts from Central Park. Daisy stood at the mirror, fixing her hair. "It's a swell suite," Jordan whispered, and everyone laughed. "Open another window," Daisy commanded without turning around. "There aren't any more," I said. "Then we'd better call for an axe." "The thing to do is forget about the heat," Tom said impatiently. "You make it worse by complaining." He unwrapped the bottle of whiskey and set it on the table. "Why not let her alone, old sport?" Gatsby said, his voice calm. "You're the one that wanted to come to town." A silence fell. The telephone book slipped from its nail and thudded to the floor. Jordan whispered, "Excuse me," but no one laughed. "I'll get it," I offered. "I've got it." Gatsby picked it up, muttered, and tossed it on a chair. "That's a great expression of yours, isn't it?" Tom said sharply. "What is?" "All this old sport business. Where'd you pick that up?" "Now see here, Tom," Daisy said, turning from the mirror. "If you're going to make personal remarks, I won't stay here a minute. Call and order some ice for the mint julep." As Tom dialed, the heat seemed to press in, and Mendelssohn's Wedding March floated up from the ballroom below. "Imagine marrying anyone in this heat," Jordan said dismally. "Still, I was married in June," Daisy recalled. "Louisville in June. Someone fainted. Who was it, Tom?" "Biloxi," he said shortly. "A man named Biloxi. He made boxes and was from Biloxi, Tennessee." They carried him into my house, Jordan added. He stayed 3 weeks until Daddy told him to leave. The day after he left, Daddy died. There wasn't any connection. I used to know a Bill Biloxi from Memphis, I said. That was his cousin. He gave me an aluminum putter I use today. The music faded, replaced by cheers and bursts of jazz from below. We're getting old, Daisy said. If we were young, we'd rise and dance. Remember Biloxi, Jordan warned her. Where'd you know him, Tom? I didn't. He was a friend of Daisy's. He was not, she denied. I'd never seen him before. He came down in a private car. He said he knew you. Asa Bird brought him around last minute. He was probably bumming his way home. He told me he was president of your class at Yale, Jordan said, smiling. Tom and I exchanged blank looks. Biloxi? First place. We didn't have any president. Gatsby's foot tapped nervously. Tom eyed him. By the way, Mr. Gatsby, I understand you're an Oxford man. Not exactly. Oh, yes, you are. You went to Oxford. Yes, I went there. Tom's voice turned incredulous and insulting. You must have gone about the time Biloxi went to New Haven. A waiter knocked and entered with crushed mint and ice. The silence remained unbroken by his "thank you" and the soft closing of the door. I told you I went there, Gatsby said. I heard you, but when? 1919. I only stayed 5 months. That's why I can't call myself an Oxford man. Tom looked around, hoping to see disbelief in our faces. We all stared at Gatsby. It was an opportunity given to some officers after the armistice. We could go to any university in England or France. I wanted to slap him on the back. I felt a renewal of complete faith in him. Daisy rose, smiling faintly. Open the whiskey, Tom. I'll make you a mint julep. Wait, Tom snapped. I have one more question for Mr. Gatsby. Go on, Gatsby said politely. What kind of row are you trying to cause in my house? Finally, they were out in the open. Gatsby seemed content. He isn't causing a row, Daisy said desperately. You're causing a row. Please have a little self-control. Self-control? Tom sneered. You think it's okay to let some nobody make love to your wife? Next thing, people will be throwing everything overboard and marrying across races. Flushed with his own nonsense, he felt self-righteous. We're all white here, murmured Jordan. I know I'm not popular. I don't give big parties. You have to make a pigsty of your house to have friends. Angry as we were, I wanted to laugh. The transition from libertine to prig was complete. I've got something to tell you, old sport, Gatsby began, but Daisy interrupted. Please don't, she pleaded. Let's all go home. Good idea, I said, standing up. Come on, Tom. Nobody wants a drink. I want to know what Mr. Gatsby has to tell me. Your wife doesn't love you, said Gatsby. She never loved you. She loves me. You're crazy, Tom exclaimed. Gatsby sprang up, excitement vivid on his face. She never loved you. She only married you because I was poor. It was a mistake, but she never loved anyone except me. Jordan and I tried to leave, but Tom and Gatsby insisted we stay, as if neither had anything to hide. Sit down, Daisy, Tom said, trying to sound paternal. What's been going on? I told you, Gatsby said. For 5 years, and you didn't know. Tom turned to Daisy sharply. You've been seeing this fellow for 5 years? Not seeing, Gatsby said. We couldn't meet, but we loved each other all that time, and you didn't know. Oh, that's all, Tom said, tapping his fingers like a preacher. You're crazy. I can't speak about 5 years ago, but I know she loved me when she married me, and she loves me now. No, said Gatsby. She does, though. Sometimes she gets foolish ideas, but she loves me. And I love her. I might go on a spree, but I always come back. You're revolting, Daisy said. Do you know why we left Chicago? I'm surprised they didn't tell you about his little spree. Gatsby stood beside her. Daisy, it doesn't matter now. Tell him you never loved him, and it's all over." She looked at him blindly. "Why? How could I love him? Possibly." "You never loved him." Her eyes fell on Jordan and me, appealing. "I never loved him," she said reluctantly. "Not at Kapiolani?" Tom demanded. "No." From below, muffled chords of Mendelssohn drifted up. "Not that day I carried you from the punch bowl to keep your shoes dry?" Tom's tone was tender. "Daisy? Please don't." Her voice was cold. She looked at Gatsby. "There, Jay." But her hand trembled as she lit a cigarette. "Oh, you want too much. I love you now. Isn't that enough? I can't help what's past." She began to sob. "I did love him once, but I loved you too." Gatsby's eyes opened and closed. "You loved me too?" "Even that's a lie," said Tom. "There are things between Daisy and me that you'll never know." Gatsby looked as if he'd killed a man. "I want to speak to Daisy alone," he insisted. "She's all excited now. Even alone, I can't." "Say I never loved Tom," she admitted. "It wouldn't be true." "Of course it wouldn't," Tom said. Daisy turned to Tom. "As if it mattered to you." "Of course it matters. I'm going to take better care of you." "You don't understand," Gatsby said, panicking. "You're not taking care of her anymore." "I'm not?" Tom laughed. "Why's that?" "Daisy's leaving you." "Nonsense." "I am, though," she said. "She's not leaving me." Tom leaned over Gatsby. "Certainly not for a common swindler who'd steal the ring he put on her finger." "I won't stand this," cried Daisy. "Let's get out." "Who are you?" Tom broke out. "You're one of Meyer Wolfsheim's bunch. I've investigated your affairs, and I'll go further tomorrow." "You can do what you like," said Gatsby steadily. "I found out about your drugstores. You and Wolfsheim bought side street drugstores and sold grain alcohol. You're a bootlegger." "What about it?" Gatsby said. "Your friend Walter Chase wasn't too proud to come in on it." "And you left him in jail for a month? He ought to tell you about it." "He came to us broke. He was glad to pick up some money." "Don't call me old sport," Tom shouted. "Walter could have you up on betting laws, but Wolfsheim scared him." The look returned to Gatsby's face. "That drugstore business was small change," Tom continued. "You've got something bigger now." Daisy stared at Gatsby, terrified, while Jordan balanced an invisible object on her chin. I turned to Gatsby, startled by his expression. He looked like he'd killed a man. It passed, and he began to talk excitedly to Daisy, defending himself. But with each word, she withdrew further. "Please, Tom, I can't stand this." Her eyes showed her intentions were gone. "You two go home, Daisy," Tom said, "in Mr. Gatsby's car." She looked at Tom, alarmed, but he insisted. "Go on. He won't bother you." They left without a word, like ghosts. Tom began wrapping the whiskey in the towel. "Want any of this? Jordan? Nick?" "No." "Nick?" "What? Want any?" "No. I just remembered today's my birthday." I was 30. Before me stretched a menacing new decade. It was 7 when we got into the coupe and headed for Long Island. Tom talked incessantly, but his voice was distant. Human sympathy has limits, and we let their tragic arguments fade. 30, the promise of loneliness, a thinning list of friends, thinning hair. But there was Jordan, wise enough not to carry dreams from age to age. As we crossed the bridge, her face fell against my shoulder, and the stroke of 30 faded with the pressure of her hand. We drove on through the cooling twilight. In the gritty expanse next to the ash heaps, Michaelis, the young Greek who ran the local coffee joint, found himself entangled in an unexpected drama. He was the main witness at the inquest after the tragic events unfolded. On the day in question, he had napped through the sweltering heat until after 5 in the afternoon, when he decided to stroll over to the neighboring garage. There, he discovered George Wilson, the garage owner, in a bad state in his office. Wilson was visibly ill, his skin as pale as his bleached hair, and his whole body trembled uncontrollably. Michaelis suggested he should rest, but Wilson stubbornly refused, anxious about losing business. As Michaelis tried to persuade him, a startling commotion erupted from upstairs. "I've got my wife locked in up there," Wilson disclosed with unsettling calmness. "She's staying there until the day after tomorrow, and then we're moving away." Michaelis, who had known Wilson for 4 years as nothing more than a docile, worn-out shadow of a man, was shocked by this revelation. Wilson usually spent his days sitting passively in a chair by the doorway, watching life on the road pass him by, always responding with a hollow, agreeable laugh if ever someone addressed him. He was always more his wife's man than his own. Driven by concern and curiosity, Michaelis pressed for more details, but Wilson shut down. Instead, he cast paranoid, scrutinizing looks at Michaelis, interrogating him about where he had been on specific days at specific times. Feeling the tension rise, Michaelis was relieved when some workmen headed toward his cafe, providing him a chance to excuse himself. He planned to return later, but ultimately forgot as the evening chaos unfolded. Exiting his establishment a little after 7, Michaelis's attention was snapped back to the Wilsons' plight when he heard the loud, scolding voice of Mrs. Wilson from the garage below. "Beat me!" she screamed, her voice piercing through the twilight. "Throw me down and beat me, you dirty little coward!" Moments later, she burst into the dusk, frantic, her hands flailing, just as a death car, as the papers would later call it, emerged from the growing shadows of the evening. It swerved dramatically, its silhouette hauntingly etched in the fleeting light before vanishing around the bend. Michaelis, stunned, could barely register the color of the car when he spoke to the first responding officer, guessing it to be light green. Meanwhile, another car, heading toward New York, screeched to a halt 100 yards up the road, its driver sprinting back to the horrific scene. By the time Michaelis and the driver reached her, Myrtle Wilson's life had been brutally snuffed out. Her blood mixed with the dust on the road as they opened her shirtwaist, damp from the summer heat. Her left breast hung loose, a grotesque testament to the violence of her end. Her mouth, agape and slightly torn at the corners, seemed to echo the ferocity of the life she had once possessed. We saw the 3 or 4 automobiles and the huddled crowd from a distance, their faces ghostly in the gathering dusk. "Wreck," Tom said, his voice tinged with a cruel satisfaction. "Maybe Wilson'll finally have some business." He slowed down, but with no real intention of stopping until the hushed, intent faces around the garage door made him tap the brakes almost instinctively. "We'll take a look," he said, though it sounded more like a question to himself. As we got out of the coupe and approached, a hollow, wailing sound grew louder, resolving into the repetitive cry, "Oh my God!" The voice was raw and gasping, like a soul in torment. "There's trouble here," Tom said, his excitement barely contained. Standing on tiptoes, Tom peered over the heads gathered at the entrance, the garage dimly lit by a yellow bulb in a swinging metal basket overhead. Then he made a harsh, guttural sound and thrust his way through the crowd with the brute force of his powerful arms. The circle closed behind him with a murmur of protest. It was a moment before I could see anything. Then, as new arrivals jostled the line, Jordan and I were pushed inside. Myrtle Wilson's body lay on a work table by the wall, wrapped in layers of blankets despite the heat, like a child trying to ward off a chill. Tom, with his back to us, bent over her, motionless. Next to him, a motorcycle cop scribbled in a little notebook, sweat pouring off his face. The source of the high, groaning words became clear. Wilson stood on the threshold of his office, swaying and clutching the doorposts, his eyes wild, his mouth forming a relentless, horrible litany. "Oh my God! Oh my God! Oh God! Oh my God!" A man beside him murmured soothingly, trying to rest a hand on his shoulder, but Wilson didn't respond. His gaze drifted from the swinging light to the table and back, his cries never ceasing. Tom lifted his head abruptly, his eyes glazed, and mumbled something incoherent to the cop. "MRV," the cop was saying. "Oh, no," corrected the man. "MVRO." "Listen to me," Tom snapped, his voice fierce. "Uh," said the cop. "Oh, G. The cop looked up as Tom's broad hand fell heavily on his shoulder. "What do you want, fella?" "What happened?" "That's what I want to know." "Auto hit her. Instantly killed." "Instantly killed?" Tom repeated, staring. "She ran out into the road. The son of a bitch didn't even stop his car." "There were 2 cars," Michaelis interjected. "One coming, one going." "Going where?" the cop asked keenly. "One going each way. Well, his hand hovered over the blankets before dropping, she ran out, and the one coming from New York hit her, going 30 or 40 miles an hour." "What's the name of this place?" demanded the cop. "Doesn't have a name." A pale, well-dressed black man stepped forward. "It was a yellow car," he said. "Big yellow car. New." "See the accident?" the cop asked. "No, but the car passed me down the road, going faster than 40, maybe 50, 60. Come here, and let's have your name. Look out now. I want to get his name." Some words must have reached Wilson, for a new note entered his cries. "You don't have to tell me what kind of car it was. I know what kind of car it was." I watched Tom's shoulder muscles tighten under his coat. He walked swiftly to Wilson and grabbed his arms firmly. "You've got to pull yourself together," he said gruffly. Wilson looked at Tom, rose on his tiptoes, and would have collapsed if Tom hadn't held him. "Listen," Tom said, shaking him slightly. "I just got here from New York. I was bringing you that coupe we talked about. That yellow car I was driving earlier wasn't mine. Do you hear? I haven't seen it since this afternoon." Only the black man and I were close enough to hear, but the cop caught Tom's tone and looked over suspiciously. "What's all that?" he demanded. "I'm a friend," Tom said, not letting go of Wilson. "He says he knows the car that did it. It was a yellow car." Some dim instinct moved the cop to look at Tom with distrust. "And what color's your car?" "It's a blue coupe." "We've come straight from New York," I added. Someone who had been driving behind us confirmed this, and the cop turned away. "Now, if you'll give me that name again." Tom picked up Wilson like he was weightless, carried him into the office, set him in a chair, and returned. If someone could stay with him, he ordered. 2 men exchanged glances and went reluctantly into the room. Tom shut the door behind them and descended the single step, avoiding the table. As he passed me, he whispered, "Let's get out." We pushed through the growing crowd, Tom's commanding presence clearing a path. We passed a hurried doctor, medical bag in hand, who had been summoned in vain hope half an hour ago. Tom drove slowly until we rounded the bend. Then he floored it, and the coupe raced through the night. A low, husky sob emerged from him, tears streaming down his face. "The goddamned coward," he whimpered. "He didn't even stop his car." The Buchanan's house emerged from the dark, rustling trees, a sudden apparition of light and elegance. Tom slowed the car beside the porch, glancing up at the second floor, where 2 windows glowed warmly among the vines. "Daisy's home," he said. As we stepped out, he shot me a look, a frown deepening his brow. "I should have dropped you in West Egg, Nick. There's nothing more we can do tonight." A change had come over him. He spoke gravely, with a newfound decisiveness. We walked across the moonlit gravel, and he swiftly dealt with the situation. "I'll call a taxi to take you home," he said briskly. "You and Jordan can wait in the kitchen and have some supper if you want." He opened the door, gesturing us inside. "Come in." "No, thanks," I replied, "but I'd appreciate it if you'd order me the taxi. I'll wait outside." Jordan placed her hand on my arm. "Won't you come in, Nick?" "No, thanks," I repeated, feeling queasy and wanting solitude. But Jordan lingered a moment longer. "It's only 9:30, she noted. I'd had enough of all of them for one day, including Jordan. She must have sensed this in my expression, for she abruptly turned and ran up the porch steps into the house. I sat down, head in my hands, until I heard the butler on the phone calling for a taxi. Then I walked slowly down the drive, intending to wait by the gate. I hadn't gone 20 yards when Gatsby emerged from the shadows, his pink suit glowing under the moonlight. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Just standing here, old sport." For a moment, I thought he looked like he was casing the joint, ready to rob the place. I wouldn't have been surprised to see Wolfsheim's goons lurking in the bushes. "Did you see any trouble on the road?" he asked after a pause. "Yes." He hesitated. "Was she killed?" "Yes." "I thought so. I told Daisy it was better to take the shock all at once. She handled it pretty well." He spoke as if Daisy's reaction was all that mattered. "I got to West Egg by a side road," he continued. "Left the car in my garage. Don't think anybody saw us, but can't be sure." I disliked him intensely by now, and didn't bother to correct him. "Who was the woman?" he asked. "Her name was Wilson. Her husband owns the garage. How did it happen?" I tried to swing the wheel. He broke off, and suddenly I guessed the truth. "Was Daisy driving?" "Yes," he admitted after a moment. "But I'll say I was. She was very nervous leaving New York and thought driving would steady her. The woman rushed out at us just as we passed a car coming the other way. It all happened in a minute, but she seemed to want to speak to us, thought we were someone she knew. Daisy turned away from her and then lost her nerve, turned back. The second my hand touched the wheel, I felt the impact. It must have killed her instantly. It ripped her open. Don't tell me, old sport." He winced. "Anyhow, Daisy floored it. I tried to make her stop, but she couldn't, so I pulled the emergency brake. She fell into my lap and I drove on." "She'll be all right tomorrow," he said. "I'm just going to wait here and see if he bothers her. She's locked herself in her room. If he tries anything, she'll flash the light." "He won't touch her," I said. "He's not thinking about her." "I don't trust him, old sport." "How long are you going to wait?" "All night if I have to, till they go to bed." A new thought occurred to me. If Tom found out Daisy had been driving, he might see it as a sign, connect dots that weren't there. I looked at the house, light spilled from a few downstairs windows and a pink glow from Daisy's room. "You wait here," I told him. "I'll see if there's any commotion." I walked back along the lawn, the gravel crunching underfoot, and tiptoed up the veranda steps. The drawing room curtains were open, revealing an empty room. Crossing the porch where we had dined that June night, I found a rectangle of light at the pantry window. The blind was drawn, but I peeked through a small gap. Daisy and Tom sat opposite each other at the kitchen table, a plate of cold fried chicken between them and 2 bottles of ale. Tom talked earnestly, his hand covering hers. Occasionally she looked up and nodded. They weren't happy, and neither had touched the food or drink, but there was an air of intimacy, as if they were conspiring. As I crept away, I heard the taxi approaching. Gatsby waited in the drive. "Is it all quiet up there?" he asked anxiously. "Yes, it's all quiet," I said. "You should come home and get some sleep." He shook his head. "I want to wait till Daisy goes to bed. Good night, old sport." He turned back to his vigil, hands in his coat pockets, the moonlight casting a lonely glow over him. I walked away, leaving him standing there, watching over nothing.